for a punishment crew goes from 30 to 3,000 like that. I don't know about you, you ever have a party, and you're inviting a couple people over to your house, and all of a sudden there's a whole lot more people, and there's not enough food? It's very stressful, and I've got to imagine that they were stressed in the same way. What do we do? And in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47, what we see is this: the prescription for the church, the beginning of the church, the reason why we meet today. And I want to read these words to you. I want to spend some time looking at them, because what we see in these verses is some powerful stuff, some life-changing stuff. And I think some things that can change us as we move forward as a church. So let's read together. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. Selling their possessions and goods, they gave to anyone as he had need. Every day, they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. It wasn't just 3,000. Because then they started forming this little thing called a church, and more people began to be added to that number. And I wonder, what was it that they did? Did they have cool media? Was their speaker really funny? What was it? What made this church, the church in Acts, so powerful? It really comes down to two things. The first one is communion. You see, the first thing the disciples realized was this: there's a whole lot of people, and we don't know what to do with them. So we're going to do what our teacher told us to do right before he left. And in John 13, we see the image painted for us. As Jesus sitting around a table with his closest friends, he breaks bread, and he says, "This is my body broken for you." And then he takes a cup with wine and says, "This is my blood shed for you." And then Jesus goes and washes the feet of every single one of his disciples, even the one who would betray him. And Jesus laid the picture for the church. You see, that was the first communion. Every time we get together for Easter or Christmas or whenever else we decide to do it when we have communion, the whole idea is that we get together to re-experience that moment when Jesus had with his disciples. And what I want you to think about today is, why is it that they do that again? Because communion is what God has envisioned us for. In fact, this is what communion is. It is a sacred, exclusive gathering meant for a specific set of people where God is invited. If you've ever heard it said before by a pastor, he says, "Do not take communion unless you are reborn in Jesus Christ." Why? Because it's not just wafers and juice. It's the very act of communion, of unity, where it is sacred and holy, set apart for God's people and himself. The first thing that the disciples do in verse 42 is they break bread together. Why? Because communion is what God desires for his people. But let's be honest for a minute. When was the last time that we had that kind of communion? When was the last time that you and I were able to sit down and break bread together and reflect on who Jesus was? It says that the disciples did this with those who followed Jesus, not every now and then, but consistently. And then in verse 44 it says this, that all the believers were together and had everything in what? Common. And I don't know about you, but I have a couple of hobbies that we probably don't have in common. I like McDonald's runs at 10:30 at night. That's a hobby of mine. I don't know if I invited you out, if that would be something that you would do. Maybe some of you would. College students, I'm sure would. And yeah, I can see Sean shaking his head. But the reality is that when they meant that they had everything in common, it meant two things. The first one is this. There was a literal attitude of, what I own, I do not own. All of it belongs to the community. All of it belongs to you. My TV belongs to you. My cloak, it belongs to you. It was a shared community. But you know what the other thing was that was really interesting? Is that they shared one thing, namely Jesus Christ. Because remember, Pentecost happens. We have different languages being spoken, the same message but different languages. Why? Because the gospel needed to be heard for all nations, all tribes, and all tongues. So the church isn't just Jewish people. The church is a broad group of people. And Jerusalem is a main center of trade. So the gospel's being heard throughout the world because of what's happening in Jerusalem. So this church wasn't one race, one color, one ethnicity, one gender, nothing. It was a group of people, a hodgepodge mosaic where Christ was centered. We may not be able to speak the same language. We may come from completely different social classes. But in God's church, where there is communion, it doesn't matter. Because if you have Christ and I have Christ, we're good to go. Communion is what God desires for His people. But see, then we've got this other word that God uses, and I want us to think about this, that God has commissioned us for His kingdom. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. I want to play a real quick game with you. What is this? Okay, who did it? Okay, great. And why did He do it?
He got commissioned.
He was commissioned, correct?
Yes.
Good, okay, let's go to the next one. Who's that? Mona Lisa. And who did this one? Leonardo da Vinci. And what?
He got commissioned.
He was commissioned. It's a really interesting story about this one. I'll tell you in a second. And the last one is? Okay. Rodin. And why?
He was commissioned.
He was commissioned. Exactly. See, it gets easier. Don't you wish multiple choice tests were like this? It would be great. If you think about it, the Medici popes were the ones who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel. Why? Because he was a better painter than the popes were. If the popes did it, it would be a bunch of hats, and that would be it, right? Okay. And then you've got Leonardo da Vinci. The funny thing about this is that the Florentine family were the ones who asked Da Vinci to do this. But the reason why is because the particular woman was quite ugly, and it took a very specific type of painter to be able to make her look okay. That's actually the story behind it. And then Rodin's thinker, I'm not sure why the Germans commissioned him to do that, but that's just what happened. But I want you guys to think about this. The word commission means this: to be declared worthy to act for another. And in Matthew 28, Jesus tells His disciples, those who will follow Him, this, that we are to go out into the world and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And we call that the Great Commission. Why? Because God has declared you and I worthy to be His kingdom ambassador. The funny thing is that God doesn't need us. He chooses to use us to increase our joy and to magnify His glory. What an honor it is to be artists for God, to be painters for His masterpiece that we call our faith. You and I are commissioned. But too bad we don't paint, huh? Because what happens in here, I think, is a little bit tougher than watercolors. Verse 45 and 46 say this. Selling their possessions and goods, this is their commission, they gave to anyone as he had need. Verse 46, every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. There are two things that God has commissioned you and I to do. The first one is this. We are to live with an open hand. An open hand is this, not that. But see, sometimes what you and I want to do is have an open hand, but curl it just a little bit. God have an open hand with these things, but not that. God have an open hand with you on Wednesday evenings, but Sunday afternoons, that's football, God, I'm sorry. Wednesday night, American Idol. God says we're supposed to live with an open hand. They sold everything they had to benefit their communion, those who were a part of their sacred community, their set-apart gathering, and those who were in need outside of it. That's a challenge in a commission. You don't believe me? Flip over to James, where James writes this. True religion is this, that we are to take care of widows and orphans. That means that widows and orphans are your responsibility.